This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Are prisons and jails America's new asylums? Today, we spend the hour looking at how a disproportionate number of people facing mental health challenges have been swept into the criminal justice system, where they lack adequate treatment. At least 15% of men and more than 30% of women in jails have a serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, major depression, or bipolar disorder. This is the focus of an incredible documentary by filmmaker and psychiatrist Ken Rosenberg. The film is called Bedlam.
Very busy day.
Mental illness is not something people want to hear. It's not something they want to talk about.
I'm calling from LAC USC. I was calling because we have a patient here. She's here in our psych ER.
The state of mental illness in this country is beyond the trite notion of crisis. It's at a point of comedic absurdity. The number of people that we've just completely given up on is just staggering.
A lot of people down here suffer from mental health issues, and that's why they're down here. I suffer from it, and these people suffer from it, and there ain't no help nowhere. It's just sad.
We have historically not fought for people with mental illness. When people are rising up and saying, we are sick and tired of our families being thrown away.
No justice!
As long as doctors tolerate these working conditions and the outside world won't know what's going on, then nothing will ever get better. The definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over and expecting different results. The way we treat mentally ill in this country is insane.
I'm afraid that's the system.
That's the trailer for Bedlam. It'll be airing on PBS Independent Lens. One of the voices you heard was that of Black Lives Matter co-founder Patricia Cullors. In the film, she and director Ken Rosenberg and many others share their personal experiences of family members who've chronic psychiatric conditions that have pushed them into the path of police officers, emergency room doctors, and prison guards in Los Angeles County. Patricia's brother, Monty, has lived with schizoaffective disorder since he was a teenager. Ken's sister struggled with schizophrenia. After the film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival last January to a standing ovation, I sat down with Patricia Cullors and Ken Rosenberg, who's also an addiction psychiatrist affiliated with the Weill Cornell Medical Center here in New York City. In October, he published his book, Bedlam, an intimate journey into America's health crisis. I asked him why he chose the name Bedlam.
Bedlam was the first mental institution in the world, started in Bethlehem, England, and was nicknamed Bedlam because that was just how people got to know of it. It is a name now synonymous with chaos and craziness, and I think it very much describes what's happening now in America, that the mentally ill are on the streets, they're in the jails, they're part of a system that is utterly insane. They lack treatment, they lack research, they lack resources. So hence the name Bedlam. For me, this is a professional film and a personal film. It's a film, I have to say, I've always wanted to make, and in some ways kind of dreaded making, frankly, because I never thought that I would share my personal story. In fact, until I was 40 years old, I never told a soul that my sister was schizophrenic. I grew up in a time and a place when I'm Jewish, it was called a shanda, the Yiddish word for shame. And I think that although I became a psychiatrist to help families like my sister, it took me many years to be prepared to share that story. When I made this film, I made the film to show the tragedy and the trajectory of the seriously mental ill in America, particularly in Los Angeles, which is the epicenter of the crisis. But I also realized that the families didn't know why I was telling this story. The viewers didn't know why I was telling this story. And I needed to really be honest with them. And people like Patrice and her beautiful, kind brother, Monty, volunteered to be in this film to share their stories. So I thought at some point, a couple years into it, the least I could do is share my story. So when you watch the film, you know the person behind the camera as well as the people in front of the camera.
Your sister is the reason you became a psychiatrist?
Yes, when I was 14 years old, she was institutionalized. My parents would not allow her to be in a hospital very long. And when they took her out of the hospital against medical advice, it was pretty much then and there at 14 years old that I decided I was going to be a psychiatrist for a couple of reasons. One is because I thought, well, maybe I could do some good where I saw no good being done. And secondly, psychiatrists seemed to understand what the hell was going on. They understood what was going on in my family and in my world. And so for me, being in the family therapy session in which my parents announced, understandably, that they had enough and they were taking my sister out of the hospital, I thought, this guy, he was a guy, this psychiatrist really understands things. I want to join his ranks.
So you tell the history of how the mentally ill are dealt with in the United States. Talk about that through deinstitutionalization and what we're seeing today. The mental asylums of our country are this nation's jails and prisons.
That's correct. The jails are the de facto mental asylums of the day. Deinstitutionalization began in the late 50s, early 60s. Well-meaning individuals did it, President Kennedy among them. We had these new drugs, Thorazine coming into play, lithium coming into play. And so for the first time, people with serious mental illness were able to leave the asylums, and they were able to live outside the asylums. The asylums at the time were dreadful places for the most part, where people were not getting care, and there were quite a number of scandals about them. In fact, Life magazine ran an article in 1946 with the title, Bedlam. That was what Life magazine called it. And it's actually about a mental hospital not that far from where I lived called Byberry, which was closed. So from well-meaning individuals, and probably for the best of reasons, the institutions were closed and mentally ill people went out. And hopefully, President Kennedy said, would be welcomed into the welcoming arms and warmth of the community. Well, unfortunately, that warmth never came. And shortly, the community mental health centers that he built never came. And when President Reagan took over, the money for the community mental health centers, the few of those that were built, dried up. So essentially, we did this. We took people out of the asylums, put them onto the streets, and now put them into the jails. We made being mental illness a crime, and we treat them like criminals. And of course, they become cycled in and out of the criminal justice system, exposed to all the things that happen, all the traumas that happen. Of course, poverty becomes a part of this cycle. Poverty makes mental illness worse, and may even cause mental illness in some way. So we've made the situation so much worse through deinstitutionalization. Bringing back the asylums is not an answer, but bringing back care surely is.
President Kennedy himself, his own sister, Rosemary. Tell her story.
Well, Rosemary was born with some kind of birth defect. It's not clear. It was never so clearly documented. Probably some form of mental retardation. And as often happens, as she got older into her young adulthood, she became more psychotic than anything else. And she got the treatment du jour, the treatment of the day, which was a frontal lobotomy. That's the treatment that won the Nobel Prize in 1949. That's the treatment that a rich and powerful person with a mentally ill child was able to get, a frontal lobotomy performed by none other than Walter Friedman, who was a neurosurgeon who toured the country with an ice pick in his station wagon and did thousands upon thousands of frontal lobotomies. And we thought that was the best we were had to offer. And perhaps it was, which is quite dreadful. Rosemary did not do well. She had to be institutionalized for the rest of her life. And as a result, President Kennedy, when he took office, wanted to take care in some way of people like his sister, the mentally retarded, and people with serious mental illness. And that was part of the genesis of deinstitutionalization.
Patricia Cullors, talk about your life story with your brother Monty.
So I grew up in a neighborhood in Los Angeles called Van Nuys, and it was there was four of us in my mother's home. She was a single mom, and my brother Monty was one of my first best friends. In the film, you'll hear Ken talk about his sister in the same way, and it was really amazing growing up with him. He was fun and funny and playful, and I could talk to him about everything.
What was the age difference?
We were only about 3 years apart. So at a certain point in his own life, we started to see different issues. We didn't know it was mental health issues.
He was your older brother?
Monty's my older brother, yes. He's 3 years older than me. And I believe if Monty received early care, early intervention, he would have probably ended up not having to spend majority of his life inside of a jail cell. But instead, in our community, we were given criminalization. And I remember some of the first signs of my brother's depression, what I would now understand as depression, was anxiety. I remember him having pretty bad mood swings. And then when he was 18 years old, he was diagnosed inside of the Twin Towers, Los Angeles jail correctional facility, where he was also tortured by the sheriff's department.
Talk further about that. He started being arrested when he was like 14?
Yes.
You were 11?
Yes, he was. His first arrest was at 14 years old, and he was kicked out of middle school and didn't end up going to high school. He started using drugs around that time as well. And now, from everything that I know about mental health and substance abuse, they often go hand in hand. It's called dual diagnosis. My mother, we went to lots of jail facilities to visit him. We also went to a lot of rehabs to visit him. And he was never treated for mental illness, not until he was, in fact, incarcerated.
You talk repeatedly in the film, Patrice, about, if you will, the illness of shame and how that intensifies any situation.
Absolutely. I grew up in a very private home. My mother, because she was a single mother, I think she felt a lot of her own shame about being a teenage mom, being poor. We didn't talk about a lot of things, including my brother's substance abuse and mental illness. I ended up straying from that, and I found a lot of solace in being honest and transparent about what was happening. I found the movement. I ended up joining a local organization. While they weren't dealing with mental illness or law enforcement violence, they were talking honestly and openly about issues of racism and poverty. And I started to make the connection of how I grew up and what was happening to me, my family, and my brother in particular.
Patricia Cullors, co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the people featured in the documentary Bedlam, directed by Ken Rosenberg, which is set to air on PBS Independent Lens next April. As we continue to look at how prisons and jails have become America's new asylums, that's the focus of an incredible new documentary called Bedlam. Earlier this year, I interviewed director and psychiatrist Ken Rosenberg, whose own sister struggled with mental illness, and also one of the people he features in the film, Black Lives Matter co-founder Patricia Cullors. During the film, Patrice's brother Monty is in and out of jails and psychiatric institutions. I asked Patrice how she sought help for her brother Monty while he was incarcerated and also upon his release.
My brother was 23 years old when he was released from his first prison sentence. And during his time in prison, we would receive letters from him telling us that they had put him in the psychiatric wing of the jail facility. And my mother and I were confused. We didn't know he had any psychiatric issues, and so we also didn't know that we could call anybody. We can call a warden, or we can call a prison psychologist. So we just sort of took his word that, that they were messing with him. When my brother was released from state prison, when he was 23 years old, I went and picked him up from the Greyhound station. I hadn't seen my brother in 4 years. I was so excited. I took my friends with me, and when I saw him, I was very disturbed. He had been released in boxers and flip-flops and a white undershirt. And I sort of looked around, is this sort of thinking, is this some sort of joke? And he had these dark sunglasses on, and his whole posture was completely different from the brother that I remembered going inside. So I remember, putting him in the front seat and asking, Monty, are you okay? Are you okay? He was sort of hunched over, super quiet. And he said, yes, I'm fine. And he was sort of tight-mouthed. And when we got to the house, my mother said, she kind of pulled me aside. She said, something's wrong with my son. I said, no, nothing's wrong. He just got 4 years of prison. It's going to take some time for him to acclimate. 5 days in, my brother was completely psychotic. He was, completely out of his mind, and we did not know what to do. I didn't know what to do. My mother didn't know what to do. None of my friends had dealt with anything like this. So I called a good friend of mine, actually a teacher of mine, and said, this has happened to my brother. Do you know what's happening to him? His partner happened to be in school of psychiatry, and she said, it sounds like he's in the middle of a psychotic episode.
What was he doing?
He was putting on 2 pairs of shoes, he was babbling, he was up, he hadn't slept. So my mother and I were taking shifts trying to stay up to see if he was okay. He was writing things on the wall with toothpaste. It was just literally watching someone deteriorate. So I was told to call the police. Actually, I was told to call the ambulance by the woman who was in psychiatry school, and I called the ambulance. And I made the mistake in telling the ambulance that my brother had just been released from prison. And they said, we don't pick up convicted felons. You have to call the police. And I battled with them for a few minutes. I said, I refuse to call the police. My brother has been tortured by the police in prison. And I ended up calling the police, and they came, and I had a long talk with them outside. I said, what do you plan on doing if my brother gets violent? I don't know if he will. I've never seen him like this. And they said, well, we'll just tase him. And I sent them home. And we eventually were able to get my brother in the hospital, but that was my introduction to my brother's mental illness. Nobody warned us. There was nobody telling us, no case manager, no caseworker giving us the 411. We just had, it was trial and error, and it was incredibly, incredibly scary.
So when he was in prison, he was in solitary confinement a number of times, is that right?
So, yeah, he spent a significant amount of time in the SHU, a segregated housing unit.
And you also realized and then started educating yourself, and as you do, educate everyone else at the same time. But this issue of him going to court and not being in a criminal court, you found out that there was some kind of mental health exemption or court that you could take him to so he wouldn't again go through the criminal justice system.
So there's always been a mental health court, but it's only given to certain groups of people. Monty should have been, first of all, Monty should have never been incarcerated. But in his times of incarceration, he should have been given the offer of treatment and the mental health court. The reason why my brother, in a lot of ways, this last time of incarceration was given mental health court is because now I'm Patricia Cullors of Black Lives Matter. And I know everybody in local office. And so the minute my brother was incarcerated, I emailed the sheriff himself, former sheriff, I emailed the undersheriff, I emailed the ACLU, and I said, I basically said, get my brother help. And they all know what they did to my brother, and not everybody has that access and resource. And so Monty was lucky enough to go to mental health court and end up getting some sort of treatment, not the best. It should have been way better than he received, but he didn't end up in a jail cell. But then I think about people like Todd, Todd should have been able to be released that day. And because he had an old strike on his record, was sent back into jail.
So Ken, Dr. Rosenberg, talking to you in both your capacity as a director and also a psychiatrist. Patrice just mentioned Todd. Tell us about Todd's story and the different track he ended up being on.
Well, Todd's story is painfully typical. The mental institutions, as we say, are the jail. So where do people with serious mental illness end up? They end up in and out of jail.
Can you tell us percentages?
Oh, Lord. I mean, in the jail, I think we think it's 1 out of 4 people in the jail have a serious mental illness. We know that there are 2,000 people as we speak in Twin Towers Jail with serious mental illness. We know that there are at least 20 to 25,000 people sleeping on the streets of Los Angeles with a serious mental illness. The numbers are mind-blowing.
And even the guards and many are talking about, I mean, the one thing they may agree with activists on is the issue of they need help, they need training. I mean, if the mentally ill are going to be put in the prisons, these guards are definitely not trained to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, we have people on all sides of the aisle involved in this film, Republicans and Democrats, because I think that no matter how you look at it, this is, as we keep on saying, an insane process. If you're just interested in dollars and cents, hopefully you're not, but if you are, you know that this is an utter waste of funds. If you have any care for your fellow humans, you know this is a terrible way to treat people. So you asked me about Todd. His story is painfully typical. People end up cycled in and out of jail. They don't get any kind of jail-assisted or judge-assisted treatment, which is extremely powerful. Something called assisted outpatient treatment, which means that you don't even have to end up in jail. You just have to have a great need for that. And there is a process in place on the books in which people could get treatment, or family members could help their loved ones get treatment.
So they're sentenced to treatment instead of jail.
Yes, and also, well, there's 2 things. There's mental health courts, which is if you commit a crime, then you have the option, hopefully, of going to a mental health court where the judge says, clearly your problem is mental illness, and you committed a minor offense, but you have strikes against you, and before you know it, you're in and out of jails and you're in and out of the streets. That's mental health court. There's something else called assisted outpatient treatment, in which if you have someone who is refractory to treatment, doesn't get better, is in and out of hospitals, even if they have not committed a crime, you could get them, a judge, to say, hey, look, you need treatment, and my job is to help you get treatment before you end up in the criminal justice system. Todd got neither. Todd got, what most people get, which is, it's just the gavel was banged, and he ended up back in jail, and he ended up back on the streets and back in SROs. And
Todd had AIDS.
And Todd had HIV as well. So Todd was really trying to struggle not only to deal with mental illness, but to deal with physical illness. Unfortunately, that's very common, right? Because one begets another. Poverty begets mental illness. Trauma begets mental illness. Mental illness begets more poverty. It's an utter downward cycle.
Describe what happened with your sister, and I'm sure even to this day this is very difficult, but you do it so poignantly in the film.
Right.
So you have different situations. Patrice and her brother Monty has been dealing with this as a mental illness for a long time now, and has opened up her family. Whether or not at the beginning they wanted to talk in this way. Yours, you went a different track because your parents were so close to this idea of revealing what happened to Beth.
Right, so my sister was very, very sick, and I ended up, when I was 16, as soon as I could drive in Pennsylvania, where I grew up, I ended up taking her personally to a mental hospital more than once. And, we tried to provide her with treatment. She was extremely resistant, as were my parents. The treatments really didn't have that much to offer, frankly. That was part of the problem. But unlike Monty, we were able to find her treatment and not a jail cell, which was, quite a remarkable thing when you think about it. But Meryl ended up, not getting proper treatment. And when I was starting college, actually the first month I started college, she unfortunately jumped out the window and nearly died, breaking, as I say in the film, nearly every bone in her body. And of course, it's terrible and tragic. And I actually...
Your parents said she was running from an intruder.
My parents told everyone that there was an intruder in the house, but I knew that the only intruder was in her head, and was the voices in her head which probably commanded her to jump out the window. So I stayed home for 2 years. I didn't go away to college. I stayed home for 2 years to try to help her and help my family. And then after she could walk, pretty much in the second year, I transferred to college and went to college in Boston. Really never came home and never went again into her room until just about a year ago in making this film, and decided that I would kind of confront that demon, if you will, in the room in which she jumped. I should say my parents died, my older sister died. So in 2005, I was kind of left in charge of Merrill. And by then, she had resisted every possible effort to treatment. We were unfortunately engaged in a battle that I was losing. I found a convalescent home for her to go to. She refused. She didn't want to see a doctor. She said and persisted in saying there was nothing wrong with her. Her problems were maybe spiritual, but not psychological. And then, sadly, I finally called the police. My parents had said, never call the police on your sister. But for 2 weeks, she did not pick up the phone, and I finally called the police, and they found her dead in her bed.
So this is what prompted you to make the film?
Exactly. She passed away in 2005, and you know, in 2010, my kids were thankfully and successfully launched as adults, and no small feat there as well, right? And I thought, you know, what's the most meaningful thing I could do with my life at this point? And I love my patients. I love being a psychiatrist. I love being a filmmaker. Made 4 films for HBO. But I thought that at this point in my life, what I could really do is make a film about the tragedy of the severely mentally ill for my sister, but more so for millions upon millions of Americans, and in some ways for myself as well.
Patrice, as Ken was doing this film, you co-launched the Black Lives Matter movement. You founded the Dignity and Power Now. Talk about the convergence of race and class, and when someone is mentally ill, what happens to them, when police intervene, what they do to them based on their race and class.
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that in each city, each county, each state, they decide how they're going to respond and relate to people with mental illness. In Los Angeles County, the decisions that have been made have largely been around investing resources into criminalizing people with mental illness. And what you've seen are mostly poor folks, mostly Black, mostly brown, mostly women who are domestic survivors, domestic abuse survivors, and people who are at the margins, trans folks, street sex workers. I mean, really, these are the folks who have been left to fend for themselves. And when you have a mental illness and you don't have family support, you know, I think that was something that was, I always feel like I'm not doing enough, and that my family, like, if we just, you know, if we could just do this more or this more. And watching this film, out of all of the subjects in the film, I realized that our family is doing a lot, and you could see the difference. You could see the difference around the outcomes for each of these folks, and it reminds me that we've really left it to family members to have to be the caregivers. And when we're not trained to do so, and when we have our own lives, and many of us either have to give up our lives or sacrifice our lives, and not because we don't want to, but we need more resources, we need more support. And I remember on one of my brother's last hospitalizations, you know, me yelling at the social workers, like, what am I supposed to do when he comes home? What else is there for him? You all have to help us figure this out. And we've luckily been able to build really great relationships with the other doctor in the film, Dr. Dias. And my hope is that folks watch this film and come out the shadows for themselves and talk about their mental illness.
Talk about Ezell Ford.
Ezell Ford was a young Black man from South Central. He lived with schizophrenia. Everybody in the community knew it, including law enforcement, LAPD 77th Precinct. And he would go and play basketball every day at the basketball courts. And on his way home from playing basketball, he was apprehended by LAPD, by 2 officers who shot him in the back. And those officers had actually, he had had confrontation with those officers in the past, and they knew about his history of mental illness. And when his mother came forward, Shatobia Ford, she told, you know, the public, my son didn't deserve to die. He had mental illness. And till this day, we don't know why those cops shot and killed him. But what we do know is that more than half the people who are killed by an officer, whether it's by a taser or a gun, have some form of mental illness.
And you talk about the police knowing Monty as well. They know him as a person in the community, and why community policing is so important, where they understand who the people are, the community is.
Yeah, and I argue, Amy, that police shouldn't be the first responders to people with mental illness. We have to reinvest our dollars into real community care, real community mental health care. As we've talked about on this program before, Los Angeles is trying to build a $3.5 billion jail. And one of those jails is a mental health jail. And as we say, our slogan is you can't get well in a cell. And we are...
You can't get well in a cell.
Exactly. And we are begging the County Board of Supervisors and the Sheriff's Department to rethink this plan and to put those dollars into community-based solutions.
So talk about the protests, because one of your most powerful solution always is activism. Talk about your protest.
Absolutely. In 2017, over 40 organizations launched a coalition called Justice LA. Our primary goal is to stop the $3.5 billion jail plan, one, and two, get those dollars to be reinvested into community-based solutions, including community-based clinics that can deal with mental health and the mental health issues in our communities. We launched a protest where we built 100 replica jail beds, and in those jail beds, we were able to put them on the streets of Los Angeles, right in front of the County Board of Supervisors building. Those are the decision makers. They get to say whether that jail gets built or not.
So how many bunk beds did you bring out on the street?
We built 100 replica jail beds. So when we worked with a studio who thought they were doing it for a film shoot, a Hollywood film shoot, and we broke the news to him a week before that he built those jail beds actually for a protest. We hired all formerly incarcerated people to work on those jail beds, and we ended up finding out that the person that was lead on building the beds had actually had his own run-in with law enforcement, and so it was incredibly meaningful for him to build those beds. We put them out on the street. We held up traffic for 8 hours, and we talked about the mental health crisis in Los Angeles County, but also that Los Angeles is a microcosm of what's happening around the country.
I mean, what's so powerful about this film, Bedlam, is that we're watching people going through their crises in real time. How did you get Monty, your brother, to agree to this filming?
I didn't. He got himself to. Yes, we went through we had a lot of conversations. We had like a dinner with Ken at some point, and when I first asked him about it, I said, hey, this is totally up to you. Like, you could do it, you don't have to do it. Like, it's up to you. And he said, no, I don't want to do it. And I said, okay. And then I called Ken, I said, my brother doesn't want to do it. Talk to you when I talk to you. And he said, okay, no problem. Call me if he wants to. And my brother went into the hospital, and he called me while he was in the hospital. He said, because at that point HBO was gonna be producing the film with Ken, and he said, that guy that's producing that film for HBO, I want to talk to him. I said, okay, why do you want to talk to him? He's like, well, I'm interested in doing the film now. And I said, okay, well, why are you changing your mind? And he's like, why? There's just a lot of things that happen in here, and I think people need to know about it. And this is in the middle of an episode, and I think it's important for people to know that even when people are in the middle of a manic episode, that they can still make decisions. And I called Ken. I said, my brother wants to talk to you. Here's the payphone number. And Ken called Monty, and they talked, and Ken called me back and said, your brother said he wants to be a part of the film. I said, okay, great. So that happened a couple times, that he would tell me he didn't want to be a part of it, that he would say he'd want to be a part of it. And then finally he said, yeah, him and Ken built their own relationship. And I think that was really important. What obviously doesn't get talked about in the film is that Ken is building a relationship with his subjects. We're talking all the time. He's not just calling when he's going to film. He's asking how my brother's doing. He's asking how I'm doing, how my mom's doing. And we've at this point have known each other for 7 years, and we are with each other in some of the most intense crises. And for folks who there's
and Ken, you're a psychiatrist. It's not only a director; he's a psychiatrist.
He's a psychiatrist, and he's had his own loved one go through the similar crisis. So in some ways, it's sort of, I don't know if I could have done this film with anybody else. I don't know if my family could have done this film with anybody else. And the subject and topic is so sensitive. It is.
Did it change your mother's view of mental illness and willing to be public about it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My mom is a very private person. She didn't want to be on film, on camera at first. And then she decided she wanted to be on camera because she said, Teresa, you always do everything for us. I'll go on camera and I'll talk about Monty. And you saw her in a couple scenes, and that took a lot for my mother to do that.
That's Patricia Cullors, co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement and one of the people featured in the new documentary Bedlam, which will air this April on PBS Independent Lens. Patricia Cullors is also author of When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir. I spoke with her and Bedlam's director, psychiatrist Ken Rosenberg, at the Sundance Film Festival. Since then, the campaign to stop Los Angeles County from building a new jails at the expense of medical treatment and social services has been successful. In fact, on Thursday, the Los Angeles Times ran an editorial headlined, 2019 was the year LA County finally said no to new jails. It describes how a planning group is now working with the supervisors on proposals for alternatives to incarceration and includes attorneys, activists, and people who are formerly incarcerated. The LA Times writes, quote, as the proposals come before the board, the coming year will test whether the county's historic shift from incarceration to a system based on care, mental health care, medical care, reentry services, housing, peer support is achievable and affordable, and whether it can prevent crime, reduce recidivism, and repair broken communities, end quote. As we continue to look at how prisons and jails have become America's new asylums, this is the focus of an amazing documentary released this year called Bedlam. Earlier this year, I interviewed director and psychiatrist Ken Rosenberg, and also one of the people he features in the film, Patricia Cullors. As we concluded our interview, I asked him about one of the strongest lessons of the film, early intervention. But first, I asked director Ken Rosenberg to tell the story of the woman Johanna, one of the people in the film who suffers both from mental illness and relies for help on the kindness of strangers, including the film crew.
Yeah, so Johanna, I mean, and all these folks who we film, even Todd, who attacks his doctor, I mean, when you get to know them, you realize that they're good, kind, loving people who have bad illnesses. So I think it really puts a human face on this illness. But Johanna is among those. I mean, she comes in, she's manic, which means she has elevated mood, racing thoughts, doesn't sleep for days, is psychotic, somewhat detached from reality, and comes into the ER in this state. Rapid fire talk, flight of ideas, and then, gets put to sleep, which is essentially what happens in the ER, in which people are given a, quote, cocktail, end quote, which consists of sedating benzodiazepine, an antipsychotic drug, and maybe an antihistamine. And with that, they are put to sleep and transferred to another hospital, or in some cases, sent back home, or in some cases, stay in the ER for days, potentially weeks, looking for a bed. So Johanna, we follow through her life, and she goes in and out of 10 hospitals. We see her at home. Her dad is not able to be at home with her, and as a result, her home is in shambles. And we actually take her, my fearless and brilliant camera crew, Joan Churchill and Alan Barker, take her to the ER. I'm on the phone from my office at the time, and she's saying, Ken, you gotta take me back to the hospital. And my wonderful camera crew is, where the hell do we take her? And the only place she'll go is 50 miles away from her home at the LA County ER, which is the only place she feels she could get some help. And we follow her, and she ends the film with some sense of, great sense of recognition that she has a terrible illness, that the illness is not caused by the medicines, but caused by a brain dysfunction, which she really has to address. Now the medicines are really not very problematic. They put sometimes hundreds of pounds on people. They have many side effects. And this is, of course, a big concern of mine because treatment and research is nowhere near where it should be. Can't say that enough. So Johanna suffers from these side effects, including weight gain, but Johanna also demonstrates the sort of kindness to humanity that all the people in the film demonstrate, family members and patients alike.
Talk about the role of the pharmaceutical industry in funding and researching, treating serious mental illness when the federal government doesn't do it and private industry does.
Well, you know, what did Tennessee Williams say? Blanche Dubois, we rely on the kindness of strangers. I mean, that's where we're at. We rely on the kindness of strangers. We cower in the corners, pretty much as family members. Patients are too confused and diseased, and often denial, part of the illness, is a denial. It's called anosognosia. It means that you don't know that you're sick. And with all this, the pharmaceutical companies make drugs which make profit. And I can't say I blame them, I can't say I applaud them either, but it's an industry. They're out to make profit. They have shareholders who are investing money when profits to be seen. However, that's all we rely on. We don't have people marching the streets until, thankfully, people like Patrice, who say, no, we need more. We're not going to rely on the kindness of strangers. We're going to demand more, like people with HIV did, like people with breast cancer did, and say that we really must have proper research, proper treatment. And that's what we need. We have the same molecules, essentially, that we use for treatment that were invented 70 years ago. 70 years ago, we developed lithium and Haldol. That's what we're using today. That's just not right. And we can't let the pharmaceutical companies create drugs that are kind of what we call, not a great term, but we call Me Too drugs, which are they take the same molecules, reinvigorate them, take away the side effect, make them a little bit better, but recycle the meds until they get off patent. And then when the drugs get off patent, the pharmaceutical companies say, you know what, those old drugs, they're not so good. We have a new drug that's really good.
And of course, when you say get off patent, that means generics can be made and the industry is losing profit.
And they're not making a profit from it. And again, I can't blame them. I think as industries, the pharmaceutical industries do a lot of good. But is that what we should rely on? I mean, that's not right.
One of the strongest lessons of the film, aside from we have to completely overhaul policy, punitive policy, the prison industrial complex and incarceration and how it relates to mental illness, but also early intervention. So, Patrice, what would you say to people about how to detect this in loved ones and what you do?
I think, you know, there's two things that I think about when I think about having a loved one with severe mental illness. One is family members being educated and educating others about the early signs. Like I said, my brother had early signs of mental health issues, and we had no idea what they were.
What were those early signs?
Severe mood swings, really low lows, you know, depression, what I now know as anxiety. I remember one time my brother sort of locked himself in the bathroom for hours. He was maybe 16 years old and I was 13, and I kept knocking. I said, Monty, what's wrong? And he just couldn't stop crying. And I remember him finally opening the door and saying, I don't know what's wrong. And we didn't know. We had no clue. And so those early signs, you can get help. You can go to a clinic and see a therapist. You could see a psychiatrist. But the other thing is we have to be advocates, not just for our own family members, but we have to change what is happening right now. We are living in a moment where policymakers, elected officials are completely divested from supporting people with severe mental illness. It's easy to ignore them. It's easy to ignore the families. And it's such a hard illness to respond to and relate to that I think people don't want to deal with it. they don't want to deal with it. And so I strongly believe that now is the time to organize and advocate to change laws and change the way our institutions are dealing with our loved ones.
Oh yeah, we really need to change. There's something called an IMD exclusion, by the way, which is a law on the federal books in which the feds do not reimburse Medicaid funds for the people who can't afford insurance, if they're in a psychiatric facility with more than 16 beds. So if you're if you have a facility, if you're building a hospital, a psychiatric hospital, 16 beds is your limit. Of course, we could build a jail with 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 beds.
3,300 beds.
But you can't build a psychiatric facility with more than 16 beds and get federal money coming back.
How can that be?
How could that be? That's the way it is.
16?
Well, this was developed in the Johnson era, and probably again for good reasons. They wanted to disincentivize big institutions. They wanted to incentivize community mental health, and they didn't want to warehouse people in big hospitals. But it doesn't make sense in 2019, does it?
That's filmmaker and psychiatrist Ken Rosenberg, director of the film Bedlam, author of the book by the same title. Patricia Cullors is co-founder of Black Lives Matter. Bedlam will air on PBS Independent Lens April 13th, 2020. Oh, and this update. Patricia Cullors told us about 2 months ago her brother Monty stopped taking his medication and was living on the streets. He was released from Sherman Oaks Hospital after being involuntarily detained by the psychiatric emergency team. She then found him at the Los Angeles downtown Metro jail and bailed him out. He's been in the hospital since then. With the help of the Los Angeles Department of Mental Health and her staunch organizing efforts, Patrice is currently in the process of getting conservatorship of her brother. And that does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Rabbi Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Nadura, Marie Astudio, Adriana Contreras, and Maria Terracena. Special thanks to Renee Feltz. I'm Amy Goodman.